And I am not aware of any free society which has chosen to permanently, and in all cases, proscribe preemption or prevention. And I don't think any free people would elect a government that would, in any and all cases, prescribe that. And I give some weight to that, again, with some careful cautions about the fact that people can make bad decisions and do make bad decisions. Over the course of time, I think there's a certain wisdom there that we need to acknowledge. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Joe, and I want to thank the panel for staying spot on time. Excellent work. I think before we go to question and answers, perhaps we should offer David and Steve the opportunity, if they want to make any quick comments on the discussant's remarks. Anything you want to?
Sure. I'll
for a moment.
Thank you very much for those very thoughtful and probing comments. I think I agree with really a lot of what you said. Just maybe a couple of thoughts. You said you kind of posed or recast some of the things that I was saying in terms of the question of discrimination. And I think there's one sense in which you were right to do that, maybe another sense in which that was perhaps a little bit mischaracterizing the way that I was putting the argument, in the sense that traditionally, of course, the way that we've thought about discrimination is the requirement to only use directly targeted force against combatants, never against non-combatants. And that those set of obligations were seen to be equally distributed to all combatants on all sides of every conflict. All right? So it didn't matter whether you were fighting a just war of self-defense or an unjust war of aggression. You know, you equally had the obligation not to target non-combatants. You equally had the permission to target combatants. Now, the way that I've been thinking about this is not that way. So the way I'm thinking about it is to say that there can be, you can violate somebody's rights by killing them, even if they are a combatant. So I think that if somebody, if a state engages in a military action that is unjustified, it's an act of aggression, then even if they only kill soldiers on the other side, all of those deaths are unjust, and they're violations of rights. And I think the sense in which you're right to say, maybe the right way to think about prevention is that you narrow the field of discrimination. I think that probably coheres with the comments that I made at the end, which was to say that, well, if we're thinking about, the concept of conspiracy, and we're drawing a distinction between, appropriate military planning and wrongful conspiracy on the other hand, I do think that's a coherent distinction to draw. But it seems to me that those cases of wrongful conspiracy will often be very, very localized by, normally a small cabal of people at the very, very top of the military and political hierarchy. So if what you're saying is, well, in cases like that, those people might be liable to be attacked, so that we kind of narrow very radically the field of discrimination, then I think that that's probably right.
I mean, the example there would be Iran.
Right.
If you were to attack Iran at this point, based on the potential threat, I presume that you would at least be justified in attacking the nuclear facilities directly and those who are engaged in the production of nuclear weapons.
Well, like you say, a lot of it depends on the context and the.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, but the form of the justification would have to take exactly that form. That those individual people were engaged in an action that was demonstrably wrong, that they were responsible for it in meaningful ways. Again, it's not the same thing as saying that they're guilty for doing that, but there was a degree of responsibility and direct participation in that. I think what wouldn't be correct is to say that Iran would be liable to a full-scale regime-changing invasion that would.
I don't want to take away time for questions, but the question that immediately pops up, though, is can you ever then respond militarily against a military that is conscript-based?
I think it's a really good question. I mean, I think, again, the way that I think about conscripts is that there are a lot of conditions which might lead us to say that there's not, they're not guilty for doing what they're doing, but still, they're there within the chain of command. They are engaging as free agents in military activity. They're firing weapons. Those are things that those are doing.
Depends on. I mean, if you're a conscript, in some senses, you have the enemy's guns to face and your own behind you, and so
this happens in Iraq.
Kind of different.
Yep.
Sort of tools.
It's different. Yeah.
you have any quick comments?
Yeah, I'll try to make it quick, because I also don't want to cut into question and answers, but at the risk of sounding defensive, which I don't want to, I do agree with your point about evidence. I was probably wrong to characterize it as ignored, and that, you know, as analysts, we recognize policymakers, one, incredibly smart people, very capable. They have lots of access to information that the analysts sometimes don't have. They have lots of experiences that you know, make their considered judgments. You know, I'd say trump an analyst in a lot of cases, if not most. That said, I do think there was an issue in the run-up to the Iraq war. Why it was a sensitive issue, or that sometimes felt that you were ignored, is that when you have access to other evidence or other evidence that you consider, as I tried to indicate in my last remarks, there still needs to be sort of an empirical standard that is applied to that. In a lot of cases, and some of it's been documented, that the same sort of standards that the intelligence community tries to use in weighing and judging information and sources of information weren't applied to some of the information that was later cited as support for some of the positions that the administration took. And also, and again, at the risk of sounding defensive, when people talk about the record of the intelligence community at prediction or assessment, a more formal term, I always say, yeah, compared to who or whom? Yes, predicting the future is a hazardous task. You don't get a lot of things right. You know, that's generally the record of it, but compared to whom? Almost, you know, you look at the financial press prior to 2008, did they get everything right? Do you look at sports writers who have access to all the information about all the teams? Do they get it right when they look at who's going to win? And even on policymakers, you know, over the years, even going back to the Team A, Team B panel of the 1970s, looking at the state of the Soviet Union, the Soviet threat. The intelligence community, in historical respect, usually comes out better than the people who were coming in and criticizing the intelligence community on where they were. And while we may not have gotten it right in some cases, in a lot of times we're much closer to ground truth than other folks. So fair point on your part, but I did want to say we recognize the differences and accept them. And just, again, been characterized by one pundit in the Washington Times as vulgar empiricist, and we actually kind of embrace that. We don't mind being a vulgar empiricist. We just kind of wish everyone else would be that way as well.
Well, thanks for that. I'm going to take the criteria, or the prerogative, I guess I should say, of the chair to ask the first question to the panel. And I want to bring it back to, I think we're already introduced the conference, and that is, how do we translate many of these ideas now into policy? And I want to push the panel a bit on that. I guess the question I want to ask the panel is, does this discussion on preventive and preemptive war help us right now, as we're really dealing with a thorny problem here of the responsibility to protect with respect, for example, to Libya? And I know there's a panel tomorrow George Lucas is going to chair, but our distinguished keynoter touched on this, so I'd like to get the panel's thought. Does this discussion of preventive and preemptive war, the criteria one applies, is that useful at all in thinking about the knotty question that policymakers are scrambling about at the moment? It would seem, in a way, one could say preventive war is preventing a threat to us. As our keynoter pointed out, every states have a legal responsibility to protect their populations. In the case of responsibility to protect, as we see in Libya, it's similar in a way. We're preventing a threat, but it's to somebody else. We don't perhaps have the same legal responsibility, but it's a threat to someone else. But there's that challenge for us, and I think for policymakers, to explain that, to galvanize international support and galvanize public support. And Joe certainly touched on that in his discussant remarks. But there's a clear difference. Preventive war obviously ends in a somewhat clean fashion, one could argue, perhaps. Saddam was taken out. The Taliban were taken out. There is a sort of finality. We may not have done it that well, and it was made, what was it, Secretary Rumsfeld was a little untidy there afterwards, but there was that ending of the threat, at least to us. Responsibility to protect leaves us in perhaps a bit more of a murky position in that it doesn't have that clear-cut finality. Right now, one could argue you have this conundrum where under the criteria of the responsibility. One should bomb Gaddafi's forces who are threatening civilians in Benghazi, and then if the rebels are able to threaten the Gaddafi-loyal city of Sirte, you should start bombing the rebels, which is going to be a pretty difficult thing to explain internationally, let alone explain to the American people whose side are you actually on here. Also, questions of precedent, I think, need to be addressed. And how do you deal with that? I mean, certainly we move more quickly in this regard than we ever did in Bosnia or in Kosovo or never did, certainly in Rwanda. But where does that leave us now if we're on a quick change in thinking about this, about Syria or Bahrain or Yemen? I mean, if Mr. Assad should start wiping out a city, as his father did, does that then, because of a precedent we have established now, move us quickly in that direction? And finally, pick up on this question that Joe threw out at the end on liability. I mean, how does that question of liability, which David discussed, very interesting, I thought, apply in this regard? Is it illegal for us, for example, to take out, deliver a tomahawk to some poor Libyan air defense guy who was quietly doing his job manning an aging Soviet air defense weapon as the preliminary part of the attack? He wasn't threatening any civilians in Benghazi. Or the guy who simply is driving a truck delivering sea rations to the people who are moving on Benghazi? Or do we need to be more discriminatory in these type of missions based on what we've learned in our thinking about preventive and preemptive war? I hope that's enough of a question.
Maybe I can just have a couple of thoughts on that.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure that I would see what's going on in Libya as necessarily involving issues of preemption and prevention in the way that we've been discussing them here, in the sense that what we had was a humanitarian crisis that had been caused by the decision of the Gaddafi regime to use force against its own people that was really already in full swing. People had been shot on the streets, troops were moving towards Benghazi. Very clear indications that he was going to slaughter very large numbers of people in Benghazi. So I would see that as a case of, even beyond imminent threat. This was actually threat that was in full swing. But in terms of your kind of broader questions, all of which are very, very important and very interesting. But my own view on the intervention is that we shouldn't be taking one side or the other. My view is that the UN Security Council actually got the mandate absolutely right when it said that there was a cause for using all necessary means to prevent civilians. And it seems to me that is exactly the way that we should be crafting the mandate of the operation here. The force should be used to open up a space for an indigenous peaceful politics within Libya. And we ought to make it very clear that we will strike against government troops that attack civilians, and we will also strike against rebel troops that attack civilians. It becomes a little bit more complicated, obviously, when you phrase it in terms of attacks on civilian areas rather than attacks on civilians themselves. But the basic principle, to my mind, should exactly be that one, that we are there to open up and protect that space for peaceful politics, and that the people that we can use force against are any military forces on either side who are threatening or attacking civilians.
Steve?
A little difficult area for me, so I'll try and be careful, but just from what I read in the newspaper, I think the intelligence challenges is that clearly Libya has not been outside of proliferation and terrorism issues of that much concern to the United States, so I suspect there's not been a tremendous effort to collect on it over the years, and that, as you can read from the paper, there's a lot we don't know about what's going on and who's involved. So from the intelligence perspective, meeting that high threshold of knowledge is going to be very, very hard, and in some respects might be more dependent on how capable the analysts are at going back and mining libraries for what we know about the tribal confederations and in Tripolitania and other parts of Libya, and trying to figure out who's who as best we can, and to get a sense of it. And again, this was humanitarian intervention, at least the way I was reading it, which again is an issue that the intelligence community kind of struggles with, because when you start talking about the question of national interest and again trying to get a good take on what is the threat, and really the net assessment that has to be done. And you got to remember, the intelligence community, we assess the bad guys or the foreign folks when the United States starts to get involved, it actually becomes more complicated. I started my career working the Iran-Iraq War, and at the time it was just Iran and Iraq, and it was probably the best time of